So, welcome to the first episode of Past Capitalism. The idea here is to discuss efforts to create basically parts of the economy, if not an entire economy, not dominated by capital. And there's a lot to unpack in that show concept. So I'm just going to go ahead and not do that right now and jump into the first topic of the very first show. So my guest today is Marcus Peters. He is a friend, a collaborator, a cooperative developer, and a labor organizer. And we'll get into at least two of those later on. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So the topic today broadly is the forestry industry. And I just want to start by sketching out I guess, a few of my thoughts, kind of based on reporting that I've done and conversations that I've had. And then I'll sort of throw it to you to get your perspective on those, and then we'll sort of dive into your work. And the idea here is to really kind of get into what are the sort of pathways for transforming this sector of the Canadian economy in particular. So the forestry industry accounts for about $24 billion of Canada's GDP, so not a whole heck of a lot. In the scheme of things, that's about 1/10 of the oil industry, which I think is about 10% of Canada's GDP. So it's presumably in the 1 to 2% of GDP range. But it accounts for about over 200,000 jobs, which is actually about the size of the oil industry. So despite being 1/10 the size, it punches above its weight in terms of the amount of employment that you get for that GDP. And the bulk of those jobs are in BC, Quebec, and Ontario, although every province basically has some kind of forestry industry. Even Nunavut, as it turns out, which I was kind of astounded to see.
Even PEI.
Even PEI. So profits have actually been really good in the forestry industry lately. So there was some like serious slump in the market. There's the forest products and sort of raw logs, basically log exports are run on a boom and bust cycle. So there's booms where demand is really high, and then that goes way down, and everything has to contract, and mills close, and all this stuff happens, and then it ramps up again. So we seem to be, at least as of 2017, and Marcus, you can correct me if this has changed since then, we seem to be in a bit of a boom right now. In 2017, the total profits were $6 billion, and profit margins were at like 10%, which is pretty significant. So if you divide that by the number of workers, you would actually get like $28,000 in just profits per worker. So in the hypothetical world where this industry is run by workers or worker cooperatives, that would be $28,000 per worker in bonuses or surplus to do something else with. So about 93% of Canada's forest is on Crown land, and presumably quite a similar proportion of the forestry and logging is also on Crown land. And generally the way this works is that the government gets paid a stumpage fee, so they get paid for each stump that's created, basically by cutting a tree down. The government gets paid a certain amount. It generally tends to be very nominal, but nonetheless, there's a few $1 billion in revenues that come into mostly provincial, but some federal government money comes in from this. And while there's a number of Indigenous people certainly work in the forestry industry, when you talk about Crown land, I mean, it's really Crown land. I mean, what we're talking about is either unceded traditional territory, which means that the underlying title actually belongs to the Indigenous people of that area, or it's treaty land, which means that they have rights associated with that area in terms of stewardship, in terms of being the right to be consulted, which it's very unclear what that means. It's very much there's a lot of different jurisprudence about that. But in any case, there are land rights that apply to a pretty significant, if not the vast majority of the land that forestry happens on in Canada. So, but as it turns out, and again, in my understanding, there are some like really significant and important exceptions to this, but most of the forestry, the land that forestry happens on is not controlled by those First Nations. They don't really have any say at all in sort of what happens, how it happens, stewardship of the ecosystem or anything like that. They just kind of get to sit and watch the trucks go by, and some people get jobs. So when you look at policy, and the big sort of policy proposals around the forestry industry, there tends to be a lot of emphasis on value add and secondary manufacturing. So the idea here is that we could actually log quite a bit less and make more stuff out of those logs, like whether it's
domestically, I mean.
Domestically, exactly. Obviously, stuff is going to get made out of this log somewhere, but we could do more processing. We could do more, even just sorting of the logs instead of bulk exports. We could and sort of basically just a more refined, sell more refined products, whether that's finished doors or particular kinds of lumber or specialty items, chain sculptures, whatever it is. Or it could be like harvesting mushrooms from forests and selling those for higher value in international markets and so on. There's all kinds of possibilities. And it sounds like it would be a win-win, but my understanding, sort of based on conversations with people who live in these areas, is that the sort of handful of giant corporations that run the forestry industry don't want it that way. I think they would prefer to be the big fish in a small pond rather than like a medium fish in a big pond. And in terms of the pond being the economy and the amount of money overall that's going through. So they get to maintain a pretty tight political control over everything that happens in the forestry industry. And communities are relatively disempowered. They kind of rise and fall at the whim of these industrial players. So it's sort of an imperial model in the sense that they're one of their main tasks is sort of keeping control. So with all that said, those are just sort of some of my perspectives. But again, here with Marcus Peters, who's part of two different organizations. One is a worker cooperative, another one is a labor organizing hub, I guess. So Marcus, I guess let's just start with your reactions to my assessment. How does that stack up with your sort of experience on the ground as a tree planter and as an organizer?
Quite accurately. I will say that when it comes to Indigenous stewardship of the land, it very seldom enters the conversation at an industry level, at least on the daily on the ground work, because there is virtually no actual ownership that indigenous communities have over any of this that I've seen. But yeah, no, it's quite accurate, especially in the way that the ownership and concentration, the ownership has concentrated in the industry for the past several years. So BC, which is where I work, is essentially an oligopoly. You have a handful of mills, lumber mills, that call the shots on virtually everything to do with silviculture, which is the term for forestry. So you have Western Fraser, Tolko, Western Forest Products, a few others. I believe it's about 5. Yeah, so that's I would say it's quite an accurate assessment, especially when it comes to the way that it dominates small communities. So
Right.
The company I work at, which is Tree Amigos Worker Co-op, we're the only the only cooperative tree planting company in BC. And a lot of our operations were centered and continue to be centered around a small town called 100 Mile House in BC. There was a number of mills, like mostly for those small towns in that part of BC, they get by on forestry, right? Like that's what supplies the towns with their economy, really. It's just hundreds, if not thousands, of well-paying jobs. But recently, in 2019, Norboard, which is the mill that we were working with, decided to pull out of 100 Mile House, which was just devastating. And 100 Mile had already gone through much economic devastation for similar reasons. So Western Fraser had pulled out a few years previously. And this is literally hundreds of millions of dollars of impact in these communities. The personal stories that I heard, because we have, fairly deep connections with the town, like, people just getting screwed out of their severance packages and this kind of thing. It's just like, it's a horror show, especially for those, because most of these people have families and considerations to make, right? But the most absurd part was that it wasn't necessarily that they couldn't operate the mill. It's that they couldn't operate it at a high enough profit margin to justify it for their larger, like, national and international operations.
Wow.
So they're just shutting it down until such time as it, like, fit their books, which just kind of shows, like, how dehumanizing these kinds of, like, corporate decisions tend to be.
So are these decisions that are being made by sort of transnational investors or like Canadian capital? Like how is this, where are these decisions coming from?
So with Norboard, I'm not sure who ultimately holds the reins of power with the company, but it certainly operates at least nationally, and it's a multi-billion-dollar operation. But no, I assume it just is made in the same way that any other capitalist industry is made. It's like you have dozens of accountants plotting the progress, looking at the regulation coming down the pipeline from the government and the annual allowable cut. Annual allowable cut being the set quota from year to year on how much is allowed to be logged. So likely a big part of their decision was the fact that that annual allowable cut has only recently started to come down after being far too high for a very long time. It's getting cut by as much as 50%, just like right now, which is quite a huge number. So they look at those projections, right? They see how much they want to squeeze profit, and if those numbers don't add up, they shut it down and they move people out and they try and cut the severance. They try to cut as many corners as possible.
There's a really important point on here, I think, which I didn't sort of explicitly touch on in the intro, which is just that there's being an important part of the economy overall, but then there's also being an important part of rural economies, which
totally
is sort of has like really big ripple effects, both sort of on a bunch of different levels. But one of them is that the way Canada's sort of political system is set up federally anyway, is that rural, like, political ridings have disproportionate amount of power in terms of who gets elected there and who represents those interests. And so organizing there is really important, but also the sort of, obviously when you have 200,000 jobs spread across a bunch of rural communities, those are jobs that are anchoring the entire economy in those areas. So a dollar that gets spent in 100 Mile House, I'm assuming, I would imagine anyway, is gonna be spent at a laundromat. It's going to be spent at a grocery store. Which is then going to pay a wage, which then supports another household, who then shops at wherever else and supports another household. So you have a real significant sort of multiplier effects in terms of the sort of frivolity of capital-based decisions on communities. So in Toronto, you lose your job, you go find another one. In 100 Mile House, you lose a forestry job, and that is just going to like have a giant like wave that's going to pass through the whole community, like even a few jobs.
Yeah, it's absolutely devastating. And people that live in rural towns, when they get hit by something like that, because again, it's like, why do people choose to live where they do? Like, probably the biggest consideration is their employment, right? Because it's like, how do you sustain yourself while you live there, if not through your employment? So when like the biggest like groups that engage all these people in employment leave, it's like, the devastation is quite real, and it's felt there. All these houses go up for sale, all these people move, all these social relations get fractured. There's so much frustration. There's so much like people just like, left to their own means in many ways, and they have to leave. And so, And it does have an effect on the political sphere as well. If you see like the demographics of the way that people vote, like the rural communities tend to be more like disproportionately more conservative in the way, because they associate these sorts of decisions to like the more like, you know, liberal elites and that kind of thing. And it's that, for me, that just shows sort of a general like a lack of analysis and a lack of the kind of like discourse that really ties this devastation firmly with the sort of capitalist like oligarchs that are absolutely behind these decisions, you know?
Right, right.
Um,
So you're in a worker co-op, and just to situate it a bit, tree planting is sort of on the margins, as I understand it, of the forestry industry. So you have, you have the actual logging and the processing of wood, and all this stuff, and then sort of as an afterthought, the government says, okay, well, if you guys are going to cut all these trees down, you have to replant something, and so then enter the tree planter. And you've been part of a tree planter co-op, and I guess the reason this is interesting to me is because it's not hard to sort of see how, if the worker co-op model was to grow and take over even a significant chunk of the industry, you could see how the amount of stability that could maintain that social fabric, the amount of sort of wealth redistribution in terms of those boom time profits and the ability to maintain resilience in people's lives would be like really significant. And also the ability to root, decisions about how much to cut and so on in the sort of, multi-thousand year stewardship of indigenous peoples, and also frankly of people who live there as well. I think if they had the option, probably they would be interested in developing those kinds of stewardship relationships to the land as well, although that's not really an option. So I guess in that context, I'm interested to hear kind of both about your cooperative, but also how you see that, how you see a pathway for that model to take over more of that industry, and what the benefits might be.
Sure. It's a lot to answer. Happy to dive into it. So let's just take a step back and look at what tree planting is as a whole. So tree planting is an industry that is one-to-one tied to the lumber mills, to the logging of trees. So the federal government ensured decades ago that every time a lumber company comes in and logs the forest, they have to replant 100% of that, right? And the companies themselves don't replant it. They don't hire people to do it. So that's the market that was created for tree planting companies to go in, and that's where the industry really exists. And so this is like it's a national industry. In BC, it's about 6,000 planters by itself. And what does it look like? Well, it's seasonal work, and because it aligns extremely well with the sort of standard school schedule, it's about 40% students for that reason. There's been lots of studies on it over the years because it's quite a transient workforce, as you might imagine. The people that frequent it are usually categorized as students, people looking for a quick injection of cash, and counterculture enthusiasts. And you can be all three at once, which many tree planters seem to be. But that's kind of what it looks like, right? It's like seasonal work, transient workforce. People usually, I would say that the average span of a tree planter is probably between 3 to 5 years. There has been a significant and long-term decline in worker in both conditions, in terms of like the direct wage, as well as in terms of labor representation. So again, we're the only co-op in BC. There are no unions. There used to be unions, but there aren't anymore. And all of this has created an environment in which it is quite easy to exploit tree planters. The real wage, so we get paid per tree, it's called a piece rate, and the real wage of that has gone down. It has stagnated for about 20 years. It only went up last year, and that was in response to a labor shortage, like literally when push comes to shove, like there's not enough people here to plant these trees. and the general camp conditions, like the culture is really what holds it together, because there's so much solidarity with all these people like coming in and working together in a very, very difficult job, one of the most difficult labor jobs in Canada, in the woods, for months, living together, you know, just being very, very close in that way. So that culture is what glues it together. But the conditions that are really set by by the owners of the companies, as well as in large ways the mills, can be incredibly toxic. There was a lawsuit that was settled only a few years ago that the judge directly ruled it as slave-like conditions, where they're just bringing in migrant workers, refusing to feed them for days, housing them in shipping containers, and using referring to them using racial slurs, etc. And that's not like incredibly outside of the experience of just people you speak to on the ground. Like, we all witness some insane things that happen. So that gives you sort of a broad picture of tree planting. It's obviously a bit of a negative light on it, but there is a reason that I and others keep coming back. It's because there is, again, that community, that real community feeling around it, is really what anchors so many people into it, as well as the fact that you can make pretty decent money in a short period of time. But within all of this, just to come back to your question, like, how does the co-op and how does all this sort of organizing fit into a strategy of shifting people's labor out of this exploitative industry as it exists now, and into something that more firmly centers worker empowerment and indigenous solidarity, sovereignty of the forests, that kind of thing. So yeah, as you mentioned at the beginning, I'm part of two different organizations. The first one is the Planting Co-op, and the second one is a group called TWIG, Tree Workers Industrial Group. Nice little acronym we made for it. So I think that the way that you can conceive of these two groups is that the co-op it's a business, right? As all co-ops are. It's designed to be that model that tangibly becomes the way that we transform our labor. So as a co-op, it's like I'm an owner of it. All of the levers of decisions at the organization are there for me to enter into democratically. All of the information is transparent. The profits and the decisions around what we do with them are something that I have a direct say in. I feel that I don't need to go too much into the specifics of why a cooperative model is better. I think that anybody that's going to be listening to this probably has a pretty good idea of it. So I'll just kind of leave it at that for now. I'd be happy to dive in later. But needless to say, the co-op is sort of the model that we believe will be the vehicle to bring us into a new vision for forestry, right?
So my understanding from talking to you before is that the main sort of appeal of these of the worker co-op model in this context is transparency, wages, and also a culture specifically around issues of consent and sexual assault.
Totally, yes. So sexual violence is something that is just rampant in tree planting. You can find, articles and investigations on a yearly basis, and every year there's like these flowery promises from all these different companies that they're going to meaningfully address it and whatever. They're very good at engaging in PR strategies around it. They have to be. But the horror stories year to year are very real. So just on the subject of sexual violence, we developed like a policy with TWIG. We hired some professional advocates to create it, and we adopted it within the co-op, and it's been going well so far. I mean, I feel that the culture of the co-op is one which would absolutely prohibit anything of that nature in the first place, but nonetheless, it's something that we center. Each season begins with a orientation in which people have to go to a mandatory meeting where we talk about it. They're also required to have read it beforehand, and then we just ensure that that's something that is like put into the minds of people throughout the season, because it really is like a cultural matter, right? in the same way that in other workplaces you might see, well, in most workplaces that deal with like a dangerous work environment, you can sort of see that pyramid that they make, right? And the lowest level of the pyramid is like, it's like sort of cultural things, and then after that it's like near misses and et cetera, and the death is at the tip of the pyramid, right? And it's sort of like written into our policy is sort of that same conceptualization. If you have that like enabling culture of the so-called like locker room talk and that kind of thing, that is like the frequency of those really determine like, things like assaults, which would form the tip of that pyramid. So you really have to address it at the base, and that's what we do. But yeah, I mean, transparency of information and tree prices are also incredibly huge incentives for people, right? Because we do have like a minimum tree price, but more importantly, we just make our budget fully explicit. And that's something that like is somewhat astonishing to people that work at other companies. Like I've spoken to supervisors that, which is like upper level management. Like those are the people that call the shots in most cases in tree planting. But there's not that much of a degree of separation with tree planters. Like the real separation is with ownership, but nonetheless, these people are in many ways management. And I've spoken to people that have been in that position for over a decade and have never seen the budget of their operation, and that is baffling to me, because I'm just a tree planter, I'm not a crew boss, I'm not a supervisor or anything like that, but I can look at the budget year to year, and just based on the percentage of it, right? I'm doing this because of like a pie chart. Based on the percentage of it that's allocated to my wage, I know like whether or not I'm getting screwed. I know like, how much everybody is being paid, and that's something I vote on directly, and that's something that like I pass along my consent to. So it's these sorts of things which are they might seem small, but they're really foundational to the differences between working in a collectively owned, democratically operated organization, a co-op, versus the traditional model where you're just told shut up and work, pretty much.
Cool. So let's get into how do we transform the forestry sector into a one that's doesn't have co-ops at the margins but has co-ops at the center. How do we get from now to there?
Totally. So I think that the way that the co-op started may have been a bit of an anomaly in many ways, because we had really two forces, I think, that I would attribute it to. The first would be Danny, who was the former sole proprietor of Tree Amigos when it was Tree Amigos Contracting as opposed to Tree Amigos Worker Cooperative. And she was really searching for like a different model by which to operate, because she had worked for like a decade or so in planting, and she had done all the positions of crew boss, supervisor, etc. And like a lot of tree planting companies in the way they start, she broke off after gathering all the information that she needed to know how to run a business to like start her own, in the hopes that it would become like something that breaks the mold. But that relationship, that friction that exists between like workers and management and ownership, like just transferred over in many ways, and it was really difficult for her. So she was looking for something different and sort of settled on a co-op as being perhaps the alternative she was looking for. So that was one thing. And the other thing was the cooperative consultant, who was a mutual friend of ours, Benjamin Prunty, who unfortunately and recently passed away, who was like there to fill that role. So when they got in touch and they started, figuring out how to do it, they really did lay the groundwork. And now that the model exists, for creating this co-op and creating this organization that will, we hope, become like the model by which a lot of the rest of the sector starts to take on. So that's a bit, again, I consider it a bit of an anomaly, just because the two people involved were highly effective at what they did and met at the right time, and we are the only co-op, right? So then the question becomes like, how do we take this model, right, and try to like bring it to the rest of the sector? There's a couple ways we could do that, but what it really comes down to is just is sort of taking that meeting of the minds that happened with Danny and Ben, and trying to do that all over the sector, trying to find those people, right, who are ready to enter into like the social entrepreneurship of beginning a cooperative, and trying to link them with cooperative consultants and trying to like build around them like a community of planters and people that want to become a part of it and are willing to invest their own money to do so. And that's quite difficult. And that is one of the roles that Twig can really step into. And it's something that we've begun already. So just, I can maybe just give a few sentences as to what Twig is. Twig is a tree workers industrial group. It's a tree planting like advocacy group. It was also co-founded by Ben as well. He definitely had a role in shaping so much of this. And it's really there to start to fill the gap of advocacy that exists for planters like more broadly, right? Because the co-op is in many ways like an island. It's an island of like worker empowerment in a sea of disempowerment. So Twig is like an avenue by which workers from any company can join, and we can start to like build up our power as workers, both by addressing like the real and immediate concerns that planters have within the various companies that they operate, and I can give some examples, as well as by building the capacity to help found more worker cooperatives, right? To like equip them with the resources and the mentorship that they need to start their own companies.
So you've got two different models. You've got the worker cooperative, which is sort of exemplifying what worker empowerment in the sector could look like in terms of worker ownership, economic democracy, or workplace democracy anyway, and maybe some better working conditions. And then you've got Twig, which is seeking to, as I understand it, organize workers within the sector. And are you specifically talking about tree planters then, or does it go beyond tree planters as well?
It goes beyond tree planters. We cover silviculture. So as I said, that's the official term for like forestry, right? And it sounds better, but it's for silviculture. So silviculture can include a lot of other industries that are essentially tied to tree planting. So another one that Tree Amigos does contracts with as well is called brushing. That's where you go into the woods, just to describe. So you have what's called a cut block. That's when they've just logged it, nothing there. It looks like a wasteland, right? And those become planted, and then 3 or 4 years after that, people will go in to do brushing, which means you go in with a sort of brush saw. It's like if you took a whippersnipper and a chainsaw and put them together. And you go and you cut everything around the tree to try and encourage the growth of the trees themselves.
It sounds even more pleasant than tree planting.
I mean, I didn't. There's others. The most disgusting sort of industry, in my opinion, within silviculture is spraying, where they basically go into the woods, sometimes through helicopters, sometimes like workers in literal hazmat suits to just like put glyphosate all over the woods and kill everything that's not the tree, because they really do just treat it like these are crops. We are planting plantations. They just happen to be in the woods,
in industrial colonial monoculture.
Oh, it's disgusting. And there's some pretty incredible stories about that as well. Like the power of the industry is quite real. Just in 2018, maybe 19, there was a researcher at a New Brunswick-based college that put out a paper, just sort of linking the fact that the deer population went down by about 80% since they started spraying in the woods, to the fact that they started spraying in the woods, and was promptly fired due to the board of the college he was working at being mostly Irving executives who had no interest in that kind of research. It created a big scandal, but it's just sort of like, there's that much brazen execution.
Back to the centralized power model and the imperial model and so on. So it's my understanding that that in the silviculture or tree planting sector, you're sort of at the margins of the forestry industry as a whole. You're sort of there because there are federal regulations or government regulations that say that trees have to be replanted. But you're basically operating as service providers for these companies, so they're getting a value from you that's greater, significantly greater um, than what they're paying you for it. So in that sense, tree planters are being exploited, but the co-ops sort of take the edge off of that exploitation by collectivizing, creating like more collective power, and creating more, sort of taking out the sort of, I guess, sole proprietorships or whatever as a sort of middleman, and negotiating collectively directly with the forestry companies. So that in itself is really exciting, but I guess the question that remains on my mind is like, how do you get from a position of being sort of secondary contractors, to starting to exert more influence over the forestry industry as a whole?
Okay, yeah, sure. So yeah, firstly, let me say, yeah, that is an accurate depiction. So the market that is created through this government regulation, and the fact that it's filled by these tree planting companies, and the fact that it's like a private like bidding process by which most of these contracts are awarded, create this real race to the bottom kind of mentality amongst tree planting companies as a whole, as they try to like underbid each other. The larger companies are easily the biggest culprits of this, and in the last few months alone, there have been mass exoduses of workers from those companies, accompanied by public statements about how awful the conditions were and how they were really just trying to underbid people, and how they were like, withholding and stealing wages from their employees. But yeah, as you said as well, like what we're really doing, if we're going to be grappling within this context, is taking the edge off of that exploitation as it exists now. So this is where we need to build this worker power to become sector wide. So one of the more ambitious goals of Twig is to achieve something along the lines of sectoral unionization, because granted, this is an industry that it's existed more or less strictly because of government regulation, but it's also not going anywhere. Just 4 weeks ago, the Liberals started to put their promise together about how they're planning on planting these 2 billion trees, right? And it's firmly attached to many climate strategies to continue to put these trees in the ground. So we can assume that this industry is not going anywhere. So what we really have,
the climate is on the side of the workers on this one.
exactly. So what we really have to do is bring workers together, right? And effectively, we have to start taking, first we have to actually like take this fragmented workforce and industry and start bringing it together. And then we have to build like a stick to beat the rest of the mills with, because that's really what we have to do. And the most effective and really the only weapon in the arsenal of the workforce to do that is something along the lines of a general strike, right? So that would be like the more long-term goals of an organization like Twig, and of the like organizing that we're doing, is we want to be able to build
sectoral general strike. That's a modest goal.
Modest. I mean, it's certainly ambitious, but I also think that it's achievable. Just due to the trajectory of the organizing we've been doing, like people are just flocking to us right now. I've mentioned those exoduses. Those people came into Twig following their exodus from those companies. And like we've worked, I mentioned earlier that I could cite some examples of the things we've been doing with Twig, through organizing in different camps and through, just teaching people how to deal with things like wage theft, things like sexual violence in the workforce. In 2019, there was a petition started at Coast Range because the employees were stealing from the rookies. The employers were stealing from the rookies. They weren't compensating them properly in the way that they were legally entitled to be. The petition forced the return of $30,000 in otherwise stolen wages back to the pockets of those workers. That petition was replicated just last season, so a few months ago, at a company called Outland. Similar outcome, about $30,000 returned. And then just a month and
It's
a half
funny
ago,
because $30,000 is the exact amount of profit per worker that the forestry industry overall extracted in 2017. So there you go.
totally, yeah. And this is just, but this is these petitions and this organizing is just at the level of the tree planting companies, and the tree planting companies themselves, for the small to mid-level companies, they're not incredibly profitable, right? And that's that's why there is so much tension that we really have to. That's like our first obstacle, is sort of like resolving much of this tension and trying to get people on the same side here, because there's like not that much of a separation between a tree planter and a crew boss, which would be the next level, or a crew boss and a supervisor. It's really when it gets to ownership, that's when it starts to be like a genuine difference, because obviously at that point you literally have different class interests, right? But then even that level compared to the mills is just not even comparable, right?
Right.
So
you're working your way up the ladder, up the pyramid, as it were, from the very bottom, basically.
In
terms of your organizing,
yeah. In many ways, yes. But we're not that interested personally, and for the folks that we're working with. Like we want to work with people who are owners of businesses to the extent that they are interested in converting to a cooperative model, or in adopting the kind of things that we think are essential elements of that model. So in bringing transparency into the workplace, into being accountable to when the employees engage in issues of sexual violence and that kind of thing. So either or, that's what we're interested in. And if that's the degree to which we would be working with people who are owners of these different companies. But what we're really interested in is the workforce itself, right? Because they're the ones that are on the ground. We're the ones putting trees in the ground. And we're the ones that bear the brunt of all of this. We are the bottom rung on that ladder that goes all the way up to the mills. And so that's it's just that a part of that, because people form social relations, and because it's just like in any other industry, you really do have to find a way of speaking to people so that you're not so that you're not dividing people into their various interests in that way. You really have to just show people that we're all really on the same side here, so that we can come together and build that stick.
So organizing, and just like any shop floor, I guess you're dealing with a very transient workforce that's spread out all over the country, that comes together for a few really intense months of work.
Yeah, exactly.
Every summer, but building that social fabric that it sounds like the ultimate sort of expression of that social fabric that you create is a worker co-op, because then you have co-ownership, you have co-governance, you have the ability to shape your workplace, your culture, your how you spend your surplus. Yeah,
exactly. We can take our surplus, our profits, and we can invest it into however we want, right? And like at the moment, the vision for the co-op is to be the model, right? So what we're going to use that profit, that surplus for every year, is towards that vision. We're going to try and both improve like our general conditions for ourselves, because that's our immediate interests, as well as like create avenues by which others can both see what it is that we're doing and accomplish it themselves.
And so once, let's say, you get established in the tree planting world, like what then is your message to somebody who's making like a solid like middle class income in like Fort Francis, working in a mill during a boom time, and they've just bought their new Ford F-150. They've got payments, like they've got they bought a nice house. Maybe they just got married and have a kid. What's your message to that worker who is complete, like, I'm assuming culturally just completely different from the tree planter, on average? How do you bridge that gap?
Well, that would be something that would be bridged at a far later time, I would imagine. But the way that I would see that gap being bridged is just by explaining that ultimately, like, the interest that's guiding all the work that we're doing is that we want that same level of dignity that workers enjoying, right? Like, tree planting is often seen as as that bottom rung on the ladder, as like a job that people are only in temporarily. And I don't think that any job that especially one that is deemed to be essential, should come with that kind of stigma and should come with that level of precarity and exploitation. So my message to somebody in that position would be that that's all we're looking for, is for somebody to be able to, run their lives and work this job more or less indefinitely, and have a degree of comfort with that. And that those interests aren't in competition. They only are to the extent that we see them as such. And that is in the interests of, the people who are actually making the profit in this industry.
Right. And I feel like that brings up another issue, which is that one of the reasons you can start a worker co-op in, tree planting is because it's one of the least capital intensive, areas of.
Yeah, the barrier to entry for someone that wants to open up is not nearly as high as it could be.
Yeah, you need workers and you need some expertise, basically.
Well, what you need is contracts.
Contracts,
right?
Certainly.
What you need is to have that relationship with a client that you're able to secure a contract. After you have the contract, everything else falls in place. And that's what people who are wanting to start this out have to realize.
As opposed to starting a mill where you need maybe $100 million of capital infrastructure in place before you can even start processing logs.
Exactly. Yeah.
So is there a worker co-op strategy there? I'm assuming that would require just state intervention at that point. You're not going to get a bunch of tree planters passing the hat and buying $100 million mill. There's no scenario in which we get to that point of power, but presumably there's a point where we get to political power that leads to that.
Yeah, I think that these, the power that we can build is certainly transferable to other spheres, including the political. What I could see us getting, the way I see us getting to somewhere like that is that we start to build, and this is the aim of the co-op, is that we start to build a federation of co-ops. Because the co-op that I'm working in Tree Amigos, we don't have an interest in becoming a super conglomerate. I don't want to work in a company where there's hundreds of people I've never met, right? I'm very much attached to the people that I work with, and we have I think a pretty wonderful community that we've built there. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to see that model expand, right? So that would just mean creating another co-op. But we also don't want to just keep creating these groups and have them have this sort of strange feeling of competition. What we want them to do is work together, and that involves federating. So what we'd want to do is create a larger federation of cooperatives, and that would be the real way to start building power in the industry. And that would also be an organization that is, feasibly could put together the capital to begin investing or starting up something like a community-run mill. But alongside a project like that, like I said, this power can be transferable. If we're building up this very real entity of collective worker power within BC and more broadly, we're also creating something that, it would be quite a revolutionary project in many ways. And the momentum that is built from a project like that, I could very, very much see these people, these workers, myself, others, going into on the ground politics, helping to transform these communities, getting people elected that would actually meaningfully engage with the issues of investments owned by multi-billion-dollar companies just going willy-nilly in and out of their communities, and actually anchoring something that's there to serve the community and work with us as the industry and workforce.
Absolutely. And so, you talked about the Liberals promising to plant 2 billion trees or whatever. It seems like that's the kind of something that somebody wrote on the back of a napkin somewhere, but it, and then it somehow turned into a Justin Trudeau speech. But it seems like also a significant opportunity for a worker co-op in the tree planting sector to say well, hey, let's talk about what kinds of jobs come out of those 2 billion trees. Are you going to have, migrant hyper exploited camps of migrant workers that are called racial slurs and basically abused in every way? Or are we going to have worker ownership that, which obviously could include migrant workers, but the point is are we going to have dignified, living wage jobs that actually somebody could, I don't know, make a livelihood from? Mm-hmm. Is there a political opportunity there?
I would say, yeah. 2 billion trees is it's a lot of trees. Just to put that in context, like
It's like
in
600,000 a year, right? They get planted
yes,
in
exactly. Yeah.
Canada. Yeah.
Oh no, it's far more than that.
Oh, really? Okay.
270 million in 2008 or 19. Last year, it went up by the biggest amount in history in BC, at least. It went up by an additional 48 million to a total of about 318 million.
Okay. All right. So that's what we're
Right.
talking about.
So if you're talking about
That's a lot of trees.
yeah, if you're talking about 2 billion in the next like 10 years, 9 years now, I think that's about 220 million extra trees per year. So that is a substantial increase. They only announced that they're starting to put this together about 4 weeks ago. So I haven't at least seen the plans of how this is going to be rolled out. But no, I would agree that there is definitely an opportunity.
I mean, it's also going to potentially cause labor shortages.
Yes, well, this is the thing, right? Like they already had a labor shortage that they addressed by sort of increasing the tree price, or at least that they've opened up the bidding price to go higher, and now they're looking to if the largest increase in industry history in BC landed us at 318 million trees, right? And we're expected to put an extra 220 million on top of that per year. This is nationally, but nevertheless, like BC is like the place where most of the planting goes on. Then that is a hell of an increase, and there is certainly like some opportunities to be scouted out there for how we're going to bring our strategy into it.
And as a tree planter, like where do you plant those trees? Is it just increasing the density of the trees, the plots that you do plant, or are there some like secret unknown like empty areas where you're just going to plant trees in a field or something?
Plains. No, actually, it's the way that planting works. More than 100% of what gets logged is replanted, and the reason it's more than 100% is because it also includes forest fires, which are more and more frequent as climate change takes its toll. So yeah, I'm not really sure how they plan on doing this. I kind of assumed, because it's the Liberals, I kind of assumed that when they said that we're going to plant 2 billion trees, what they meant was we're going to log 2 billion trees and therefore plant 2 billion trees.
Right.
But that doesn't seem like, that was just my cynicism, because that would be just an insane increase on the annual allowable cut when it needs to come down and is now. So yeah, no, I'm quite unsure of the details of how that's going to unfold. And I'm going to be following that pretty closely.
It's interesting because I turned on CBC one day by happenstance and heard like some guy who owns a tree planting company on there being like, yeah, this is a great idea. Like we need to plant more trees, like, because there was all these reports about how planting trees will solve the climate crisis or whatever. Like this was the hot trend for like a few weeks a while ago, and then the Liberals of course jumped on it. So.
Yeah, exactly. And that was just political opportunism. I mean, I still remember very clearly Trudeau's tweet announcing it, we will plant 2 billion trees. And then below, that's it. That's the tweet. And it just made me want to vomit. But like the way that tree planting is currently carried out, I would have my doubts as to if it is, an effective carbon sequester, because again, like it's a plantation, right? And that's something that we definitely tree planters, for all their, all their various issues that bring us together as a true working class industry, we also tend to be like quite concerned because we do want to take pride in our work, right? We don't want to be part of like a disgusting colonial industry, and people do have a lot of environmental concerns. And the way that it's carried out right now, as like a lot of like monoculture of us just planting like straight pine for acres and acres and acres in like these set conditions. When you look at like a planted block, it looks really weird later on, right? Because you're looking at like grids. They're not like actual grids, but they're pretty much of just like straight identical trees in height and everything, and it just like looks like something that you'd see rendered on a PC.
I remember going to in the tar sands near Fort McMurray. They have this like single acre basically where they're like, this is our reclaimed area.
Yeah.
And you like, we actually went there, and it was like the like trees. Yeah, there's just like a grid, and it's like a Christmas tree farm basically. And you're just like, okay, this
I
seems
mean,
like exactly like boreal forest, which is like if you go visit boreal forest, it's like there's all kinds of different plants, and there's moss, and there's
well, the
like
thing is that you
animals, and
probably didn't see a very good example there because, funnily enough, some of the reclamation efforts that are done around Fort McMurray, they do a much better job than the stuff that we're planting like in the rest of the areas, because many of these companies, uh, like it's only when it was logged, or it's generally when it was logged for trees, that it'll look the way that you're describing, right? Because the land is to be restored, so
right.
that it can become somebody's profit in like 70 years time, right? But the stuff that's been reclaimed that used to be like oil sands or something like that, incidentally, those tend to be extremely lucrative contracts for tree planting companies because they pay out really well. And they just don't give a shit, they just tell planters, like they give them like 10,000 different species or whatever. Well, it's an exaggeration, but they just tell them to plant,
Right,
and
right.
you just plant everything, every species everywhere. Density doesn't matter. None of that matters. And then it comes back, and it's quite like, it's much more natural, which is kind of funny. And it's like, and that only exists because the oil companies don't give a
Relatively
shit.
speaking, I mean, it's
Yeah.
relatively
Yeah.
speaking, more natural.
Relatively speaking, for sure.
Not
I mean, who
not an
knows what's
ecosystem
under
that's
it?
been built up for hundreds of years, but yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean that exists because the oil companies just don't give a shit. Like they were told that they needed to reclaim the land, and they don't. They just like make a budget for it and send it off and whatever, right? But it's kind of ironic that that some of the ways that it ends up unfolding looks more sustainable than some of the ways that the forests are replanted. And that's just like, obviously the oil industry is a horrendous climate bomb that's devastating the planet, but you will find these little anomalies and these little exceptions where it's like you get a glimpse of what things could look like if we started to plan out reforestation differently.
Right. So it seems like we're coming to the end of our time, but let's say somebody wanted to support a worker-owned, decolonized forestry industry. Like, what would you say is the starting point for that person to, you know, lend their support in whatever way?
Get a job there. I mean, like if you want to support it, that's fantastic. I don't have like an avenue to throw people at. I feel that there's many like advocacy groups for environmental work and for labor empowerment that they could look at. The IWW comes to mind as something that people, in my opinion, should join.
It's
If
the
you,
industrial workers of the world.
yep, exactly. Century-old labor union that was essential in helping up so many unions around the world, including Twig. That's a group that I would definitely either get involved in, or if your intention would be to just like throw some money at, that would be the one. But if like any of this struck a note with people and they wanted to get involved, like I would say like get a job in tree planting and get in touch with us, because like the people we're working with are the workforce. So that's where you got to be.
And are there other aspects of silviculture that people could get could work in that would be sort of in the path of your organizing, or is it just brushing and tree planting?
Yeah, it's mostly brushing and tree planting. That does cover quite a bit. I mean, there's other industries like people working in nurseries is another example. Spraying is another example. Pine cone picking is another example. These are like all industries in silviculture, and those are all like places. They generally are not. They're not incredibly difficult to get hired in. It's not super difficult to get hired in something like tree planting. What's difficult is doing it. Like there's a pretty big dropout rate for rookies who come in who are painted this story of working in the beautiful Canadian woods and all that kind of stuff. And then you get in and your boots are full of water and you've got like 700 mosquitoes around you and you're making less than minimum wage and you're tree planting. And you are having the worst day of your life.
In a clear-cut wasteland, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, yeah.
You paint a very appealing picture. I feel like
I'm just being real, man. It's like
this should be the promo video for.
Yeah, if after all of that you still want a tree plant, you're going to fit right in.
A new life awaits you in the off-world colonies. Um, great.
Something like that.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time, Marcus, and
thanks for having me.
Getting this episode up.
Totally. Yeah, thanks a lot, Drew, and looking forward to watching this and many others.
Take care.
Cheers.